Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Paula Ferris Show all month long. My husband, John, is joining me for the podcast. We are talking about our hottest topics. Week 1 was menopause. Week 2, teenagers. Week 3, we are talking about politics, John. And it's only fitting because of the shift of power in the White House this week.
Yes, the hottest of hot topics we saved for this inauguration week.
I can't wait to share our thoughts. But before we jump in, you guys, will you do us a solid and rate and review this podcast wherever you watch, if you watch on YouTube or if you listen on Apple or Spotify or the myriad of podcast platforms. And the reason why it's important is these platforms determine which shows they're going to promote and continue to push based on the engagement. So you could do a solid. And if you want to write something about John, go for it. John would love that.
Yes, because that's going to determine whether I continue to come back or not. So you can give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Okay. I have a feeling people are going to give you a thumbs up because they love what you bring to the show. And as do I. That's why.
As long as I get a thumbs up from you, baby.
You will, most of the time, get a thumbs up. Speaking of thumbs up, we are doing a 30-day connectivity challenge, the two of us. This might turn into a 60-day or 90-day, but we're really focusing on spiritual connection, physical connection, mental connection, emotional connection. I'm actually taking you behind the scenes of our connectivity challenge if you're signed up for my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com. So John, in our latest edition of the newsletter, I shared a very incriminating photo from our connectivity challenge that won't see the light of day on socials. You don't need to tell people what it is.
I don't even know what it is.
You don't? Okay. Well, you haven't checked out the latest edition of the newsletter, but you're going to get exclusive content, behind the scenes access. We're going to take you like insider access to what's going on in our lives, just encouraging you to live your best life. And we also do some fun giveaways. I gave away 3 signed copies of my book. Nice. You don't have to carry it all. Ditch the mom guilt and find a better way forward. So make sure you're signed up for my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com and hear the latest on our connectivity challenge. And we'd love for you to join. All right, let's jump in, John. It is only fitting because of the change of power in the White House that this week our hot topic is
politics.
Oh, yeah. Can I just say something that bothers me so much, John? Is that we, not you and I, but our society, we can only respect people and listen to people and befriend people if they see eye to eye with us.
Yeah.
It just irks me so much.
Yeah, there's so many different types of people out there, different backgrounds, different origins, and we need to figure out ways to not be so divided. And I think you're going to hear a lot about how just listening and trying to understand the other side as opposed to, hey, you need to believe what I believe, and this is why. I think just coming at it from that perspective is going to be the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay Shetty, who is a huge influencer, he posted recently something that I reposted and loved. He said one of the healthiest habits that we can learn is to take nothing personally. Don't take what people believe personally. We all have a right to our own views and our own opinions. And to take it a step further, did you notice what I'm wearing? Again, watch the show on YouTube if you want. Yeah. You can see this for yourself, but can you see the shirt I'm wearing? I'll stand up so everyone can see it.
I can. Smart people don't get offended.
Which is true.
Yeah. Don't must be very smart because it takes a lot to get me offended.
And that's a great segue into today's conversation, John, with Sharon McMahon, America's government teacher. We're going back to this conversation that we had with her on how to discuss politics with our kids, with our family, with our friends, and the importance of having people in our life that we don't see eye to eye with, that we don't agree with. She says, and this really stood out to me, and you'll hear it in this conversation, that adults don't know how to have normal conversations about politics because we have never been taught how to have normal conversations about politics.
True.
And some of the stickiness that we have navigated, John, we're going to talk about after the conversation, because having this conversation with our kids, and we've lived all over the country, so they've been exposed to a lot, right?
So yeah, we have lived in a lot of different parts of the country, red states, blue states, and so it's amazing how the people you're surrounded with, the schools your kids go to, the friend group that you hang out with, you start to really think like them and believe like them. And if you're only exposed to one narrative, that's the narrative you're probably going to grab. But I think it's been a blessing for us to have grown up and lived all across the country and in different areas. And so I think we are maybe a little bit more empathetic and can understand different perspectives. And so I'm just genuinely curious when somebody believes something a little bit differently. I'm not going to condemn them, and I'm not going to necessarily agree with them, but I'm just going to try to understand them. And I think that's the most important thing we can do.
And that hits on a really important point that Sharon makes. Stick around till after the conversation. You'll get an update about our connectivity challenge. You'll also hear our takeaways. But without further ado, here's America's government teacher, Sharon McMahon. And we're going to pick it up in the conversation where I ask her how she talks politics with her own family, but particularly her kids. Enjoy. How did you talk about politics, and how do you talk about politics with your family and your children?
It's such a good question and such an important question, because we are now seeing the effects of a large generation of adults who don't know how to have normal conversations about things because their parents are always like, don't talk about that, don't talk about that. And here we are, like, just screaming at each other on the internet because we've never been taught any of these skills.
Yes. Don't talk about it at the dinner table. Don't ever talk about it. And I'm like, since when was it bad to disagree with somebody? But just disagree respectfully.
Right. These are actual skills. No one comes out of their mother learning how to talk about politics. Like this is a skill that it's up to us as parents and as teachers to teach people how to use. So I always first like to think about it from that perspective of, this is a skill that I am going to teach you. And it's actually a skill that you'll use for the rest of your life. So we have in our family what we refer to as McMahon moral imperatives. These are sort of our family values. Here are some of the things that we believe. And within, outside of our McMahon moral imperatives.
So that's the MMIs.
That's right. That's right.
MMIs. I like that.
And everyone's free to have their own, family imperatives. Call it whatever you want.
That.
But one of the things that we always believe in as a McMahon moral imperative is that we don't dehumanize other people. And I think that is happening too frequently on the internet today, is that people who are in a group that you don't belong to are immediately dehumanized. And that's a very dangerous and slippery slope to head down. That is, dehumanization has never led us somewhere that's worth going. Right. So I would encourage you to develop your own set of family rules, so to speak. And the family rules cannot be, you need to vote for Bob, or you need to vote for Lisa, because the candidates are going to change and the political parties change over time. The Republican Party of today is not the same as it was in 1865, and vice versa with the Democrats, right? So we can't develop these allegiances to people or parties, but rather allegiances to our value systems. And those value systems allow us then to have actually measured discussions about important topics. So I think developing your own set of family values and actually intentionally having these conversations around the dinner table is far more important than just being, polite and not discussing things that are viewed as impolite. Now, part of learning these skills is telling your kids when it's appropriate to bring these things up and with whom. You don't go to back to school night and be like, hey, Mrs. Johnson, who did you vote for? Like, that's not appropriate, right? Like, there's a time and a place for every conversation, but learning when and how to bring up these things is also part of the skill set. And then also when a child comes home and is like, well, my friend Bobby's parents are voting for Lisa, and you told me that's not who you're voting for. Helping your children understand, how do you respond to a friend whose parents are voting for somebody different than you are? That's an important part of this skill as well. We might know, like, we could say the following things, but your kids don't actually know that. What happens if your kid comes home and they tell you, well, so-and-so's parents are, their dad's in jail, or their parents are divorced, or such and such has a different family structure than we do. We teach children how to respond to those types of things. What's an appropriate thing to say under those circumstances? And the same is true when it comes to, they come home and tell you that their friend's parents have a sign in their yard, or their friend came to school and said, well, my parents say that Lisa is a terrible person and they would never vote for her. How does one respond? Listen, there's about 50 million adults who need this lesson.
And look at the kids. We're the worst examples ever because we cannot have a civil conversation without making character assassinations. And this is coming from both sides right now. Why can't we see people as people instead of reducing them to a policy? They're a lot more than that. But how do you specifically, okay, so let's say my son, Landon, comes home and I'm just going to tell you, I live in Trump country. Okay. Sure. I live in South Carolina right now. Yeah. But I grew up in Michigan and I spent a lot of 6 years in Chicago and 10 years in New York. So two very blue areas. So we have been exposed to a lot. You know, we have open conversations in our home. My husband don't see eye to eye on everything politically either. How do I react to my son coming home? And again, he's hearing a lot of, because it's Trump country. Oh, you know, so every kid at school is talking about Trump, right? Because this is just where we live. But let's say he comes home and he's like, hey, so-and-so is voting for Kamala, and starts to make insinuations or tear that parent down. Like how, and let's say the shoe's on the other foot. Same thing with Trump. Oh, they're voting for Trump. How should we as grown adults and parents, like, walk me through how I should react to that? Because I know you say we have to respond carefully, but I don't think we actually know how to respond to that because it's so heated.
It is so heated. And instead of, I would encourage us as adults and as the adults in the room to always be cognizant of the fact that we are modeling for our children how they should interact with other people. Right. And so one of the things that I think is really important to say is something along the lines of, oh, interesting. Did they tell you what it is about them that they particularly like? And just to say it in a very like neutral kind of way and just saying, oh, that's interesting, in a way of like obtaining with curiosity more information versus approaching it from an accusatory, like, oh my gosh, that's so stupid. That's so ridiculous. Approaching the conversation with curiosity instead of an accusation. This is a very important skill that we can use. Oh, that's so interesting. Tell me more about that. That's so interesting. I'd love to know more about the factors that went into you making that choice. Because even if you don't end up agreeing with the person, there is still a lot that you can learn from them. And so if we explicitly teach our children this lesson that the goal cannot always be to agree, the goal needs to be to learn, because you can learn from somebody who has diametrically opposed political views from you. It does not mean you agree. Learning does not equal agreement. There's still important information to be gleaned from somebody with whom you disagree. So I think reframing the conversation instead of being like, how can Landon get his friend to agree with him about the following 5 political figures? Instead of approaching it from the like, I need to convince you, the approach of how can we learn from each other? Learning requires a respectful learning environment. Right? You would not, if you send your child to 9th grade, you would not expect or hope that their teacher would say to them, you guys are a bunch of idiots. Give me a break. How did you even end up in 9th grade? Right? Like you would be aghast.
Teacher might be thinking that, but not going to verbalize
they should not say it. Right? Right? And that we should not be saying those things to other adults on the internet or in real life conversations either. If we don't want our children to treat each other that way, we wouldn't accept that kind of treatment from a teacher to our child. We would not let that go. We would not be like, that's not a respectful environment for my child to learn in if the teacher's calling them names. If you think about it from that perspective of how do we learn from each other, it starts with a foundation of I respect who you are as a person, even if I have differing viewpoints on some topics.
But I feel like we've lost our way. Like we can only respect somebody if they align with us.
That's right.
And somewhere along the way, we got lost and just expected everyone to agree with everybody. But like disagreeing and having like differing perspectives is a good thing. But that's the issue is we can't respect somebody unless they see eye to eye with us. I mean,
that's right. That's right. I refer to that phenomenon as moral narcissism, that we are so focused on our own viewpoints being the correct ones that unless everybody else begins to align with our viewpoints, They are wrong and they should be cut out of our lives. We're guilty by association if we're friends with them, that we believe our views are so correct that they are the views around which everyone else should revolve. It's a very narcissistic way of actually looking at the world. It is. The assumption that like, I have all the correct viewpoints and your viewpoints are stupid. That's not a helpful way to run a country. It's not a helpful way to run a friendship, a family, a classroom. My perception of my own views is that they're so correct that the rest of you need to get on board with me or I'll cut you out. That's actually how people with diagnosable mental health challenges behave.
Right.
That's not the way we should all be interacting.
It's very unhealthy. So, okay, so you say we can have these conversations at the dinner table with our immediate family and our kids. How much agency do we give our kids? And I guess my question is, and I'm glad my kids have been exposed to a lot. Like we've lived in red states and blue states and, we have these conversations. How much agency do we want to give them? How much of our own political opinion do we want to share with them? And how much of our own bias do we want to share with them? So I guess like when they're younger, of course, like you have to be really careful, but my kids are older now and, they're becoming much more independent. So how much agency do we give to them? How much do we recognize our own bias? And do we share our own opinions with them?
I think it's important that they be given an age-appropriate amount of agency because children cannot learn critical thinking skills unless they are confronted with information that they disagree with. That's how we develop critical thinking. They have to be confronted with information they disagree with. Otherwise, you're just, a Stepford child? You're just parroting a bunch of talking points? That's not critical thinking. Saying the right thing that you agree with is not critical thinking. To me, I would much rather, like as a parent and a teacher, I would much rather have a child who says something that I personally disagree with, but their opinion is really well supported and researched and thought out. That to me is a far more valuable citizen and student than somebody who can be like, here's the 3 reasons I like Bob better than Lisa. That's like anyone can memorize that. That's not actually very useful, right?
No, not at all.
And so as parents, we have to be quite tolerant of our children's exploration of their own viewpoints and to help them develop those critical thinking skills by modeling at the dinner table. Oh, interesting. Why do you think that we should expand the death penalty? I would love to hear more about why you think the death penalty is wrong. Asking them, challenging their own views instead of just accepting that they're correct. They may not like it, but that's an important part of learning critical thinking skills. We have to teach our children to think critically, and that includes allowing ourselves to be confronted with information we disagree with and modeling how to handle that, and gently provoking our children, not in an unkind way, not in an abusive way, but just generally saying, and now why do you think that Elon Musk would say something like that? Or whoever it is that they're discussing, gently pushing back on our own children's viewpoints, even if we agree with them. That actually does a lot more to develop their critical thinking than just being like, that's right, you're correct about that. This idea that like iron sharpens iron, like you get better at learning how to support an argument, learning how to support your own critical thought by being able to carefully articulate why something exists, even if your parent agrees with it. That's an important skill to learn in college too. You have to be able to support your arguments.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, like as parents, we really need to lean into the curiosity aspect of it, of like staying curious with our kids, asking them questions. Okay, well, why do you think this? And yes, we can give our own opinion, but
of course,
also challenging. Okay, so this is such an issue now because this generation, they see so much of the misinformation is then perpetuated on social media. It's just, bad information can get disseminated in a matter of seconds. And it's harder and harder than ever. Non-biased news doesn't exist because we all have bias. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a bias. I grew up in a conservative Christian home. That was my childhood bias, And so I have to recognize that in every room that I go to, that this is the environment that I grew up in. I am a registered independent and I feel very moderate. But when it comes to really presenting our children with how they can differentiate between the misinformation and the real information and the slant and the non-slant, like it's very hard. I have a couple, I love Ground News. I love 1440. Ground News will tell you if the article leans left or right, because again, we all have to recognize we have a personal bias. How can we help guide our children to find like accurate information that doesn't have a slant, which is, it's very difficult. Like what direction do we point them in?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, as you mentioned, there is no information that has not been, filtered through somebody's viewpoint. And that's not necessarily bad. I think we have come to equate bias with lie. And those are not synonyms. You can actually be highly accurate while having a specific viewpoint on something. Just because somebody doesn't believe that, let's say somebody doesn't agree with being able to have your dogs off leash at the dog park. You really disagree with that. And you're very open about like, I highly disagree with it. I think people who have their dogs off leash at the dog park are just like, they're not responsible citizens. You can have a very biased viewpoint on this topic while still giving accurate information about the number of dog bites that exist in the world, how many dog licenses were sold at whatever. Like just because somebody has a viewpoint doesn't make them a liar, right? So I think that's one thing, the distinguishing between what a bias is and what a lie is are two different skill sets. So of course we don't want our children to just be like puppets for a propaganda machine. That's also not developing critical thinking skills. So in terms of helping kids find better information, I love the sources that you mentioned. I also really like Ad Fontes Media, which is ADFONTES. It means Latin for to the source. And Ad Fontes has a media bias chart that they post regularly on their social media. And they also can go to their website and find it. And they have a team of people who evaluate articles from different news sources, or they listen to podcasts or whatever it is. They have a team of left, right, and center individuals who evaluate each one of these media sources.
Important.
Yes. So it's not just one right-leaning individual who's like, oh my gosh, it's so biased, or vice versa, right? Like it's a team working on every single
That's great.
rating. And they evaluate bias, like left-right bias, but they also evaluate on this vertical axis of reliability. How much fact reporting is there versus opinion content? And this is another important aspect of this skill, Paula, is understanding the difference between opinion and fact reporting. You are uniquely equipped as a parent to talk to your kids about this. But there's a big difference between reporting, I'm here at the scene where there's 5 fire trucks, they're working on the fire at 123 Main Street. That is fact reporting, right? An opinion article is like, these Democrats, they're underfunding the fire department and they're ruining the city and they're letting the city burn down. Like there's a big difference between that fact reporting and the opinion content. And I don't know that a lot of adults are very good at distinguishing those.
They're not. There's commentators and pundits and there's journalists, but sadly, and I worked in you could call it legacy media. There is the newsrooms that I worked in are not balanced. And I'm like, you guys, it's best when there is balance, when you have ideological diversity and religious diversity. That's like, because you need those checks and balance, and you have to be representative of the country, right? In the country,
in a pluralistic society, that's a value that we have. If we want to have a pluralistic society, which we do, you also need diversity, not just of race, but you need diversity of viewpoint represented in, that diversity of viewpoint is important. So using tools like these are a great place to begin evaluating news sources. But I think one thing that, again, I feel like a lot of adults are lacking is they have become very devoted to specific news organizations and take whatever they say, whatever that news organization says, that whichever one they like the most, as gospel. And the other opposing news organizations are just like, they're just under the influence of Satan. You know what I mean? Anything they say is trash. Anything my preferred news channel says is the truth. When in reality, it's so true. We all know it's true. Like we all know there's people out there who just spend 12 hours a day with the news channel of their preference on in the background. They're just like absorbing everything they say. No person or news organization deserves your unexamined allegiance. None of them do. That's not to say they can't do good work. That's not to say that we should demonize an entire news organization, but nobody deserves your unexamined allegiance because everybody, all humans can make mistakes. And that news organization should be an example of what to say or do when they do make a mistake. Credible journalists, as you well know, a credible journalist admits when they get it wrong and they make a hasty effort to correct the record. Right? That is what credible journalism does. It's not without error, because to never have any error at all, you're probably not examining whether you're getting it right.
Yes.
Right? You're probably just being like, everything I'm saying is correct all the time. You're not actually examining whether you get it right. Somebody making an error and making a hasty effort, a swift effort to correct the record, that actually is a hallmark of good journalism. Now, hopefully it's not happening every day. Hopefully it's not everything's error ridden. Somebody making a mistake, we should not discount them as a source. Being willing and able to admit when they're wrong is an important component of trustworthiness, of being able to say, I got that wrong.
It is. And, with the advent of the 24-hour cable news network, I feel like that's when the lines really got blurred, because a true journalist is going to report the story, acknowledge their own bias. I always had to check my own bias when I'm reporting and say, okay, this is the bias that I bring into the story naturally, as we all have a bias. I want to make sure that I am now, making a greater effort to bring a different perspective to it as well, just to make sure that it's balanced. But so many journalists, and I'm not saying that I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but the lines between pundit and commentator and journalist they're so blurry, and so many
really are.
Journalists now are giving their own opinion, and I just think it's lost its way. So you said Ad Fontes Media. I love ground news. I actually really like the BBC. Go figure. We have to go to the BBC to get really great, what feels like objective reporting. I like the Associated Press too. That's where I
agree.
go. And 1440 is really good. Keep mentioning Bob and Lisa. I would love to hear more about these candidates, because
I would. Is there a Bob that I could
Bob
go
or
for?
Lisa? You said Bob. You've mentioned Bob and Lisa on the ticket. These hypothetical characters. I feel like I don't have anyone speaking for me, and I think a lot of Americans feel like this, Sharon. And I am not a government and history expert, but I feel like the reason why we'll never get a moderate candidate, and I would say I'm fairly moderate, I'm a registered independent, it's because and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like if we could have the primary on one day and independents were allowed to vote, then we could actually get a candidate that most of us agreed on, and probably a moderate candidate, because I had learned in covering several elections, again, not an expert, a journalist, but when we lived in New York, I couldn't vote. Well, I didn't vote when I was an active journalist, because I just thought that was my own moral decision. But regardless, I couldn't vote in New York. I was a registered independent. So in the primary process, I think, and don't quote me on this, but in 35 or more states, independents are not allowed to, where our voice is excluded in the process of picking a candidate. And the whole reason we have a primary that starts in Iowa and goes South Carolina and New Hampshire and all of that, and one state to the next, and depending on those 3 states, that's how the whole country goes. Yeah. And that determines the media and the momentum and the money. And the only reason we have that process is because back in the day when the political process started, the candidates needed to take the train from one state to the next. So they needed that time in between. And I'm like, if we could just do it on one day and everybody could vote, registered independents, Republicans, and Democrats, we could find a candidate that we actually like, maybe a moderate candidate, and we'd all have a say. And we wouldn't allow those first couple of states to determine everything. Because often it comes to your state and you're like, well, there's no chance my candidate's going to get in because these other states, the media and the momentum and the money have all gone towards these candidates. Why can't we just have the primary on one day where everybody could vote?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think one primary day nationwide, just like we have one general election day nationwide, one primary election day would be highly beneficial, especially because people who live in later primary states, as you mentioned, Paula, often everyone else has dropped out.
Yes.
By the time it gets to their state. You're like, there's one Republican left to vote for. There's one Democrat. That's my only option. Why didn't I get a chance to vote for somebody else? And it disenfranchises people who live it by no doing of their own, people who live in states with later primaries. So I agree. We need one primary election day. We need open primaries where everyone can vote for whomever they would like, because as
I'm writing your name on the ballot next time, okay? Actually, I might write you in this year or Bob or Lisa.
Just pick a Lisa, any old Lisa. But the idea that we should exclude people who are registered independents, which are a growing percentage of Americans who do not strongly identify with one party or the other, so they do not feel represented in the primary process. And then the third portion of that is that we need to stop allowing the parties to run the primaries, because that is why people are excluded. In some states like my own, Minnesota has a rule that we have open primaries. So you don't have to belong to a party here. I'm not registered with a political party. And you are allowed to vote in any primary you would like. So you can only choose one though, right? So you go and you say, you get a ballot and half of the ballot is Democrats and half the ballot is Republicans, and you can only vote on one side of the ticket, right? But there's no obligation to register with the party and only participate. But in many states, parties control the caucus or the primary system. And that is why we have these differing dates. That's why people are excluded, because the parties are controlling the process and they have a vested interest in only in preserving and expanding their own power. So unlike the general election, which is run by the state or by the District of Columbia, allowing the parties to control it has created this system that you're frustrated with, that I'm frustrated with as well. So I would like to see one national primary day open to everyone, not controlled by a party.
Yes. But how does that happen? That's not going to happen because every state wants power, right? Like, how could we make that happen?
We could make that happen with just by passing a law in Congress, just like we have passed a law in Congress about General Election Day. General Election Day is the first Tuesday in November, right? Like we just passed a law about that. So we could actually just pass a federal law saying that this is the designating a primary election day and designating who is in charge of primary elections. Just like states are in charge of the general election, even though the date is set by Congress, right? States still run their own elections. States can run the primary elections, but it's just going to happen on a specific day. And it should be open to everybody. Like, it's simple, but it's not easy, right? Like getting Congress to agree on something is not that easy, but it's quite a simple process to pass a law.
Yeah. You can sponsor the bill and then I'll go out there and I'll talk about it. Okay. How about
I'm all for it.
And then maybe we could do something about age limits and then term limits for Congress while we're talking about
There's
it.
There's a few people who we could get rid of, who've been in there a little too long. Also, can we add you can't trade individual stocks while you're in Congress? Can we also add that you're not allowed to do that?
Well, you think that would kind of be common sense, or, you'd have the moral compass for that, but no. Yeah, I'm a bit, if there's an age minimum, there should be an age maximum. There should be term limits for congressmen and congresswomen. There's term limits for a president. So, this has just been so exciting to talk to you.
Oh, thank you.
I just hope that we can learn to, again, it stems with us as adults being adults and to begin
That's
with
right.
and staying curious, coming up with our own MMIs, the McMahon moral imperatives. I love it. So we're pulling for your book. It's going to do great things. Paula. And can't wait for part 2 whenever that comes out. And for your sponsored bill to get this primary on one day. I'm going to be looking for that as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paula.
Thanks. Great conversation with Sharon.
Amazing.
It's just incredible. And I do want to give her a plug. She wrote this incredible #1 New York Times bestselling book called The Small and the Mighty, about 12 unsung Americans who changed the course of history from the founding to the civil rights movement. It's about people that we didn't hear of in history who had a huge impact. And I think we all feel like that. We feel a little inconsequential, a little incapable, a little unqualified. But she's like, we all have a huge impact. And it's a great book for you to read, for your kids to read. So just want to say thanks to Sharon for joining us for that conversation, and congrats on her #1 New York Times bestselling book. All right, our takeaways in a hot second. But first of all, an update on our connectivity challenge. And again, follow along with us. Go behind the scenes in my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com. You'll get access that you won't see anywhere else. We take you inside our lives and inside what's going on. And there's also fun giveaways. But John, we are about 3 weeks into this 30-day connectivity challenge, which I think you'd like to extend to 60 or 90 days.
Yeah, I think it's going great.
What have you learned?
One thing I've learned is I feel really good right now. I feel very energetic. I'm getting good sleep at night. I'm exercising. I'm trying to eat right. But in regards to you and I don't feel like we go 2 or 3 days and I look at you like a stranger and like, well, what's been going on in your life?
Right.
Because we are having these small little check-ins in the morning and in the evening, and we're trying to be intentional. And I think that's the word, being intentional about getting together and do certain activities. It's forcing us to connect, which is a good thing because you're extremely busy with the work you're doing, same as me and with our kids. And sometimes we get the leftovers, and we've really are saying we're not going to give each other the leftovers. We're going to be intentional about when we get together and what we do. And the goal is to feel more connected to you. And I feel more connected to you after 3 weeks.
I didn't realize how resentful I was of you until we started doing it. And I feel like that resentment is starting to like fade away a little bit. And if you're just joining us and you're not following the newsletter, our connectivity challenge is this. We have a spiritual component, we have a physical component, and we have a mental/emotional component. The spiritual component, for the first time in our almost 25-year marriage, we are praying every night together. Whatever religion you are, I encourage you to just deepen your spiritual connection. So every night, usually in bed, we are praying together. And then our physical component, John, we are working out together at least once a week. And that's kind of our date too. So we've taken a warm yoga class. We worked out in our gym, which is our garage. It's nothing fancy.
Or our local YMCA.
Yes. Which if you don't have a Y membership, y'all, come on. I don't think it's more than $70. I mean, at least in our area, it's like $70 for a family. It's like literally a steal. But that's kind of our date, is our physical movement, working out together once a week. And then we have our emotional/mental component, which I think for me has been probably the most impactful, because every day we ask one another, how can I best support you today? And then we are checking in. We have a board meeting on Sundays. We look at our calendar for the week and we look at what's going on, who's going to be doing what, and who has what responsibility for the week. We're also meal planning. We've never meal planned, and dinner is the bane in my existence. So
that's been probably the biggest thing that I've noticed, is just when we have the meals planned, when they're good, when they're healthy, you're a lot nicer to be around.
Our kids will say that too. I sure am. All right. So let's talk about our takeaways from this conversation with Sharon McMahon. John, the first one, developing critical thinking skills. The second thing, the goal is to learn, not necessarily agree. And the third one is moral narcissism. When we cannot befriend people or we cut them out of our lives because they don't see eye to eye with us, Sharon calls it moral narcissism. But let's talk about developing critical thinking skills, especially in our kids. I loved what she said is that we cannot develop critical thinking skills unless we're presented with information opposite to what we believe, which is incredible. How have we developed these critical thinking skills with our kids who, yes, the election's over. Yes, we live in Trump country. How did we really approach that when the kids would come home from school and kind of just repeat the narratives that they had been hearing at school?
I think it's important to really shift your mindset. And it's not about, hey, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. But getting back to, okay, I'm going to come into this conversation and I'm just going to ask questions. We'll get to what I believe and why I believe it. But first, I want to understand before I'm understood. And if you shift the mindset of how you go about these conversations to prepare you for these conversations, I just think they're going to go a lot better.
But what we were doing with the kids is they would say, oh, Kamala this or Trump that. Okay, Trump would be better with the economy. Or let's say they said Kamala would be better for the economy, though they didn't say that because, again, we live in Trump country, people. We would say, okay, why do you think Trump would be better with the economy? Why do you think Kamala would be bad for this? So we get them to think critically. Mm-hmm. And you also present information that's opposed to their view. That's how you develop critical thinking skills. And we weren't taught how to do that, right? Okay, so that's
the answer can't be, well, my teacher told me, or my friend said, or my friend's parents said. Mm-hmm. Like, have some real facts why. And if they don't have any facts, well, I can't listen to that argument unless you have some facts to back it up.
And that doesn't mean you're not in agreement with your kids. It just means you're trying to develop these critical thinking skills with them. The second thing, the goal is to learn, not always agree. And she, like you said, approach it with curiosity instead of just attack. Go into the conversation knowing that there's something to be learned from everyone. And the goal is not to agree. The goal is to learn from somebody. So you can say, I'd love to know more about the factors that went into your decision to make that choice. And even if you don't end up agreeing, you can learn something. And it's interesting what I've learned. And, we've lived all over the country. I grew up in a very conservative Christian home. I have never denied that. I'm very moderate and independent. But when I've gotten to know people and I didn't reduce them to a policy, but I actually started asking some questions about why they believe what they believe instead of going in trying to change them, I really learned a ton. And we have to factor in, everybody has a bias, and that's how they were raised. So we're all going to see the world a little bit differently and have different viewpoints. It's okay. We actually need people in our life, that push us a little bit too. And then what do you think about her definition of moral narcissism? If you can't befriend somebody that doesn't believe how you believe and you cut them out of your life, what do you think about that? I thought some people thought that was really harsh, but I was like, you go, girl. Get it.
It's a very bold term, but when you think about it, it's right on. It's like, my way is the only way. And if you don't believe my way, you're wrong. As opposed to what we were just saying, learning, okay, this is why, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. Okay. You tell me what you believe and why you believe. Yeah. And I don't have to agree with you. But I definitely don't have to condemn you. And if we're probably, to be honest, have you ever seen two people on the different sides of the aisle at the end of the conversation, one converts to the other? No, that literally never happens. So know that, but just be open to why they believe what they believe, because they're a person and their opinion matters too.
Yeah, you don't have to condemn them. You don't have to condone them. And again, smart people
don't get offended.
Amen. They really don't. So next week, we are putting a bow on the top, or maybe a cherry on the top, of our month-long Hot Topics conversations. We've talked about menopause, teenagers, politics, and next week, we are going to tackle college. Do you want to put a bow on this conversation next week, John? Are you ready to? Or a cherry on top?
It's real. It's real for us. We've got a junior, and she's looking at a lot of different colleges right now. She's very focused on what's going to be the best environment. And we've learned so much about just the process of finding a college and getting them admitted to that college. So there's just a lot to learn. And if you've never gone through it, you got to prepare yourself, because it's a lot.
You sure do. Yeah, we talk about, is it necessary finding the right school for your kid. And we're going to share some of our recent developments in the whole process that have been really eye-opening as we continue to talk about it all month long, our hottest topics. John, you want to take us out? Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. Make sure you rate, review the show. Johnny?
Yes. Thanks again for listening to the Paula Farris Show. I'm John, the co-host for this month and all of our fun hot topics.
That's right. We're going to keep talking about it. See you next week, everybody.
See ya.
I know. You guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.